Welcome back, everybody. What we're going to be doing in this relatively short video is continuing on with what we were discussing in our previous lecture. In particular, we're going to be looking at some of the social factors surrounding this concept of aggression, ones that have proven to actually increase aggression, and also ones that have shown to decrease aggression. And what we're going to be doing in this one, which is somewhat unique from the previous lecture, is we're going to be expanding the timeline when we look at aggressive tendencies, not just focusing in on specific events that trigger aggression, but things over the long run that can make somebody have a higher or lower proclivity for aggressive tendencies. But before we get to those large scale things, there is one last situational topic that I want us to explore. And this situational topic does relate pretty strongly to some of the stuff that we were discussing in our previous lecture. If you remember back to it, we spent considerable amount of time talking about how specific emotions evoked within individuals tend to be the catalysts for acts of aggression. One emotion that we didn't necessarily spend a lot of time looking at, even though it's sort of embedded within some of the ones we're looking at, or we were looking at in those classes, is this emotion of something called frustration. Oftentimes we tend to think of frustration and anger as synonymous with each other, but in social psychology, there are people who look at aggression that insist that we do want to differentiate between these two. Frustration is, by their standards, some type of emotional response that comes about by having specific goals or things that we're trying to achieve blocked. Now, how that's blocked, what exactly it entails, is kind of critical steps to this frustration aggression hypothesis. But the general idea that frustration leads to aggression, and this hypothesis in general, has been around for decades, almost a century at this point. In fact, one of the first studies that coined this phrase was back in the 1940s, when researchers brought children in, told them they were about to get a chance to play with a bunch of toys, asked them to imagine how they would play with those toys, and then half of them were allowed to go into the room where they were looking at all these desirable toys and get to play with them. They compared the behaviors of these children to ones that were given the same instructions, saw the same toys, but right before they were allowed to play with these toys, a research assistant came in, told the children that they were actually looking at the wrong room, that they were going to have to play with a different set of toys. One would just so happen to contain toys that were, by kids' standards, significantly less desirable. What they were able to show in that study was that frustration that they evoked, maybe we could call it anger, but again, we're looking at blocking of goals, we're going to call it frustration. That frustration they evoked increased the aggressive tendencies of the children that were brought into the different room. And as people started to break this down further, what they realized was that there were components to it that made aggression even more likely in these frustrating situations. One thing that seems to be a big catalyst in the likelihood of having aggression pop out when we're frustrated is whether or not our goals are partially or completely blocked. Let's say we want to watch a television show, but there's distractions around us. Well, maybe you can watch snippets of it, or maybe you miss the show entirely. Right? That degree of how much you miss can be a pretty big determinant in your reports of how frustrated you are and the likelihood of you acting aggressively as a result of it. This is also, in that example, just a single isolated incident. If your goals are frequently blocked and you are recognizing how it's harder and harder to get to those goals as a result of it, well, then that can increase frustration, which again can increase the likelihood of aggression. One other thing that's been explored, which I think is kind of a very important thing to highlight, is how important the proximity to those goals that we're getting near are when we talk about whether or not we're going to act aggressively when our goals are blocked. One of the classic studies that highlighted the importance of proximity was one done by a researcher named Harris that tapped into something that I'm guessing many of you can relate to. In this particular study, they had a bunch of Confederates get into a grocery line for just a random grocery store. And this store was apparently well known for having long lines at checkouts. And as people were waiting in these lines, they had a number of true participants come in. And at numerous points, some of the individuals in the studies would allow people to get in front of them. Essentially a Confederate allowing another Confederate to butt in line. And what Harris was able to show was that the reactions of the people being observed were dramatically different based on how close they were to the front of the line and how essentially close to the front of the line the butting occurred. If people were allowed to jump in front of somebody after somebody had waited a very long period of time and was just 1 or 2 steps from the cashier, their frustration usually brimmed over, and they tended to yell or scream or act in ways that showed not only high frustration, but high levels of aggression. If people jumped in line much, much earlier than that, then usually rates of confrontation and the aggression that we tend to link that to were not nearly as common. And this really does, again, highlight how, even if frustration is a big component to aggression, there's nuances within it that we need to know about to better understand the level of frustration that somebody's feeling and whether or not that's going to lead to aggression. One last thing that is probably important to note before we close this out is that usually when we're talking about goals and them relating to aggression, it's not all goals that lead us to be aggressive. I mean, let's say I'm craving a candy bar right now. It's not that I desperately need that candy bar and life's not going to be complete if I don't get it. So if something blocks me from getting that, I'm not going to experience a huge amount of frustration, even if I'm really close to it or it's been completely blocked from me. But if it's something I desperately want, something that I value, well, the blocking of those goals can much more likely lead to aggression because, well, it's more frustrating when we have those things happening. And this is something that we kind of see with respect to kind of this frustration aggression hypothesis that have been expanded upon over the years. There's also lots of research that suggested that this can explain some of the kind of differences that we see within different classes and groups of individuals where violence is more prone in certain groups versus others. In essence, there's some people who have their goals blocked a lot and others who just have their goals blocked a few times. And those perceptions, those components to it, can be a big catalyst for increased levels of aggression. Another area that's been explored a lot in research on aggression is how important the environment is when we look at individuals who have increased aggressive tendencies. And a lot of the research that we've been exploring over the last 40 or 50 years spun off of the work of a very famous social cognitive theorist named Albert Bandura. In the 1980s, Bandura introduced a concept called the social learning theory. It was this notion that many individuals might be developing specific behavioral tendencies like aggression or fear-based reactions to things based on some of the peers or parental figures or authority members that they encounter. He argued that a lot of the behaviors that we tend to display at young ages are a byproduct of something that we call modeling, trying to mimic or follow the behaviors of these sources of information. And his most classic study that highlighted the impact of this social learning theory and displayed children at very young ages acting in this modeling form was his Bobo doll experiment. This study, which was very controversial, asked young children to come in and watch a video of a woman doing one of two things to an inflatable doll that was called a Bobo doll. In some situations, they saw the woman acting very kindly to the Bobo doll, not actually doing much to it at all, and then the children watched her play with other toys within the room. In the other condition, children watched her do several things that were aggressive toward the Bobo doll. She pinned it down and punched it in the face. She hit it with, I believe, a mallet. She kicked it and threw it in the air. And then these children were allowed, regardless of which condition they were in, to go into the same room that this woman in the film was in and play with all the toys. And what Bandura showed in this study was that not only did kids watching the woman behaving aggressively toward the Bobo doll show much higher rates of aggression with all of the toys, but a lot of novel forms of aggression started to emerge when these kids were introduced to the notion of being violent toward this inflatable doll. If you want to see more on this, I provided a link here on this slide, and I'll also provide the link on the website for this very groundbreaking study, where Bandura not only describes what happened in the experiment, but some of the implications surrounding it. And I really want to highlight here that his work was a catalyst for a large number of conversations, because he was one of the first people to find concrete evidence that suggested that just one exposure to an adult figure, an authority figure acting in a specific way could trigger momentarily similar behaviors in us. And if you project that further, you could surmise that if somebody's continually exposed to something like kindness or violence or whatever, well, that's going to carry over to very repetitive behaviors in these kids and eventually just become a part of who they are. And this inevitably led to a very big discussion that's still going on today. It led to this idea that many acts of violence in adults or even teenagers might not just come from a random combination of social events, but this kind of growth within the individual. It's a byproduct of them being exposed to higher levels of violence and individuals who have violent tendencies. And this theoretically could be tied to not only just more aggressive people in general, but people who commit numerous atrocities. And unfortunately, in our history, if you've read the chapter on this topic, you can recognize that there are lots of individuals that have done some pretty reprehensible things, and groups that have done horrible things to other individuals in not just the United States, but across the world. And this idea of modeling suggests that there might be things that we can source these behaviors back to. Maybe not perfectly, maybe not to a point where we can guess exactly who's going to be violent and who's not. But what we could potentially do when looking at environments of people is flag them for having a higher chance of being violent in the future. And we could also kind of use this information to try to lessen violent tendencies within individuals in general. There have been other studies that have suggested the importance of exposure to violence and violent tendencies. There was a researcher named Aaron who ran many studies looking at multiple cultures and was able to show in the United States and actually even a few other countries that there was a pretty strong correlation between the reported numbers of television watched for kids and the reported numbers of violent incidents that these children were involved in. There was also studies that showed that just exposing people to a violent video game can cause them to be more violent temporarily to peers versus if these individuals are exposed to a more cooperative video game. And some studies that have shown that as we advance through more and more aggressive video games and watch more and more violent television, our perceptions of the world start to become shifted, where we see violence as being more likely in different environments, and we see more things as being indicative of violence about to start. These ideas really, again, are built off of the original work of Bandura and his concept of modeling and the importance of creating an either violent or non-violent world when we look at the end results for most children who become adolescents who then become adults. Of course, this might lead you to then think about whether or not this is a debate or just a lecture. And it is important to note that this is, for most purposes, a debate. Violent video game industries have pushed back very hard on this notion that their games are causing people to become violent. So have television shows that depict violence continuously. If we're looking for their counter arguments to why that's not the trigger, Their big argument is that all they're doing when they present people with this information is just filling their desires, meeting their wants. Their questions are usually, well, who's watching large amounts of television in the first place? Who's watching violent television in the first place? Who's playing copious hours of violent video games? Probably those people who already have a natural desire for violence that are pursuing these things. Their insistence is that what we're looking at here is just correlational research, not causal research. And they would probably suggest that it would be extremely unethical for us to just randomly select children at young ages to be exposed to violence and see how things work out. Their suggestion is that we probably should be looking at other factors as well. Socioeconomic status, the amount of violence in the families, the amount of neglect that's going on, maybe educational problems, all of these things that could be leaning toward not only increased attraction to these things, but also increased rates of violence are things that they often cite as things that need to be explored. And if we're looking at this on kind of a grand scheme, even though we do, again, see a big correlation between these two factors of watching violent television or playing violent video games and violent tendencies, it is important to note that as these things have become more and more prevalent, we do see violence in cultures where these things are becoming more prevalent going down. And in fact, historically, even though people are more aware of violence around them now than pretty much any generation before, we are continually seeing low and lower rates of violence occurring. There's always exceptions, right? We've got school shootings, we've got lots of individuals committing horrible atrocities against specific groups and specific members within populations that they don't like. Your book highlights many tragic cases relating to these ideas. But, overall, if we look at trends of past generations, past centuries, what we see is that even though today's children are inundated with lots of violent imagery, their aggression rates are technically lower than previous generations. I don't want that to dispel the correlations that we still find, but what it might suggest is there is a little bit more complexity than maybe just this notion that if we have kids watch violent television, they're going to be violent, and if we avoid that, well, then everything will be fine. And this brings us to some research that's really narrowed in, not just on people that have tendencies to be a little more violent than their peers, but people who have committed really heinous acts of violence. This brings us back to several school shootings that are mentioned in the textbook and other events where groups of individuals have taken arms and attacked other people from different groups or different societies. There have been numerous researchers that have tried to decode what the source of these horrible events are, and what they've found is that if people do have violent tendencies, there seem to be specific factors at play that lead to some really abhorrent things. One of the researchers that's looked at how much violence can come up as a result of specific factors within an environment is a gentleman we talked about previously, the person named Kipling D. Williams, who focused a lot of his attention over the years on this concept of ostracism. Many people, including Williams, have cited that most of the people that have committed many of these atrocities over the years have been individuals that have been described as loners, people that have been ostracized by their peers. And that ostracism is believed to create another important topic that pops up in many people who become extremely violent, is dehumanization, is the perception of others not being equal to them, which in turn makes it much easier for people to be more violent towards those dehumanized individuals. This is also something that's been linked to specific groups that act extremely violently towards other groups. If you look at their language, if you look at how they describe the situation and the other people, more often than not, you'll hear them referring to these individuals that they commit these acts of violence toward as less than equal to them, or even less than human. And this actually has led to a really interesting conversation when we talk about violence across cultures and groups. And it's the fact that when many cultures try to find ways to get people to bond, to work harder, one of the most effective ways to get people to work harder and bond is to create this us versus them mentality. But that comes at a very great cost. Numerous studies have shown cultures rising to try to bond by creating these bad people in their minds often leads eventually to attacks, unfair, unjustified attacks on these people that have been labeled as bad. And it might, yes, help those people who are attacking others feel closer, feel like they're justified in their actions, but obviously, as a whole, that's a horrible outcome. It's completely unacceptable for people to come together in hatred for another individual. We tend to call this sectarian bonding. And in our current world, our current environment, unfortunately, this is not something that's really going away. In fact, some researchers and political scientists have suggested that it's happening at a very alarming rate over the past decade or two. And if we don't do something about it, if we don't address it, then some of the acts of really heinous aggression that have occurred over the years are probably even more likely to happen in the near future. Again, it highlights how, when looking at violence and social psychology, how understanding the factors at play is a really important thing. And this leads us to a really important kind of closeout on this topic. How can we, if we know about things that lead to aggression, and use this information to decrease aggressive tendencies in individuals? As we just mentioned before, dehumanization, ostracism, this us versus them mentality is one of the biggest sources of increased levels of very atrocious levels of or actions of aggression. And numerous studies have shown that if we are talking about groups acting aggressively toward each other, or even people having this proclivity to lash out because of the way they feel, increasing levels of communication, finding ways to get people to rehumanize others through interactions and perspective taking has proven to be a very effective tool at decreasing violent tendencies amongst groups and even within specific individuals. If we're going back to some of the modeling research, we might not be able to say that we have definitive proof that childhood exposures lead to greater levels of aggression, but at the same time, we do have pretty definitive proof that exposure to non-violent environments, exposure to conflict resolution, exposure to situations where acts of aggression are not met with bigger acts of aggression can greatly lower the proclivity for a person who's growing up in those environments to be aggressive. And this is not only something where we can create environments for these individuals, but if we can model it as adults, as parents, show children how to resolve conflicts without going towards violence, show ways to kind of work on taking the perspectives of others, engaging in that thing that we've talked about a couple times now called empathetic thinking, where we can greatly decrease not only the day-to-day aggressive tendencies, but the proclivity of some of the more extreme violent outcomes that have happened over the years. And this is, of course, just scratching the surface on this topic. I don't think it's necessarily the best idea to go into specific examples like the textbook does, but I encourage you, now that we've gone over these ideas in the audio, to take your time and read through the readings either a second time or a first time at this point, and just look at some of the really heinous things that have happened over the years when it comes to aggression, but also when reading that chapter, I want you to consider all of the research that's gone into ways to kind of reduce aggressive tendencies. And what you'll find is some very common themes emerge. Dehumanization, modeling, creating special environments that help. These factors are not just things that we link to increases in aggression, but we can link them to decreases. And knowing more about this is always valuable information. This is also, if we're talking about the lecture, where we're going to close out for class today. It's not that we're completely done with this topic, though. Because in our next class, what we're going to be doing is looking at something that's pretty closely related to aggression and maybe even prosocial behavior to an extent. I'll kind of explain that in our next lecture, in which we cover a triad of very interrelated topics called stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination. For now, as I mentioned before, go over those readings, maybe watch that Bandura Bobo doll experiment video, and then I'll see you next time when we get into this next area that, again, is pretty closely linked to aggression. For now, take care, best of luck, and I'll see you soon.